Thank you very much for being here. My name is Paymana Asad. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Labour Foreign Policy Group. This is our launch event. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Labour Foreign Policy Group and our aims, and then I'm going to hand it over to my co-chair, Jess. We're going to tell you a little bit about why we've decided to create this group and why we felt that this moment in time was the best time to do this. So the Labour Foreign Policy Group aims to support the party to develop a well-evidenced, coherent, inclusive and progressive foreign policy, not just for the benefit of those at home here in the UK, but also for those across the world. We believe that the Labour Party has a unique window in the next 4 years to re-examine its approach and develop a strong narrative about Britain's place in the world that counters the resurgent forces of nationalism and isolationism that we're seeing currently across the United States, but also here at home in the UK and across Europe and other places across the world. My personal reason in getting involved in this group and helping to found it is because I came to the UK as a child refugee at the age of 3 from Afghanistan. And growing up in the UK in a refugee family, I didn't really see myself as much different to anybody else. But I started to realise that British foreign policy did impact my life. In 2001, when the United States invaded Afghanistan, my dad decided to sell his small business and move permanently to Afghanistan to help the rebuilding effort. That changed my life considerably. And later on, when I got involved in the Labour Party, I was looking at our manifesto. I think it was the 2015 manifesto, and there was only one line in the manifesto about what Labour's plan was for Afghanistan. And to me, that was quite shocking, considering that it was the Labour Party that had also joined hands with NATO and invaded Afghanistan, and in my view, liberated it from a very repressive Taliban regime. And so for me, I think it's very important for us to look into the reasons why we get involved abroad, but also how we can support others and build relationships amongst our own communities here at home. And so that's the reason why I got involved. And now I'm going to hand over to my co-chair, Jessica Toll, who will tell you about her reasons for getting involved in the group.
Thanks, Paymana. And like Paymana, I've seen how much UK foreign policy has affected the world and our lives, but also how much the world has changed and how much of a lack of sophisticated response there has been to that. Both Paymana and I have been part of many conversations over the past few years about what a foreign policy, a progressive foreign policy actually looks like. And they never quite get to the point. And we both felt very strongly that there's a wealth of experience and expertise within the party that we can really harness in the vein of that we are stronger by our common endeavour to really dig deep into what a new outlook and a new approach for Labour will be in this opportune moment of the next 4 years, and we hope beyond as well. And this is why our objectives for the group are not only to influence, but to build a forum for members, to build relationships with sister parties, friends of groups and other affiliates, and also raise awareness across the breadth of the party. Now, Paymana, would you like to introduce our team?
Yes, so we've got an amazing, fantastic team. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce our exec team first. So we have myself and Jess, Emmanuel Artusa Barrell, I hope I pronounced that right, Rishi Patel, Alice McDonald, and Anna Joy Rickard. So that is our executive team, and we'll be hopefully leading the way on some of the strategic insight. We're also very honoured that we have 2 giants of the Labour Party who are our co-honorary presidents. That's Baroness Jan Boyle. She's the principal of Somerville College, Oxford, and she was the leader of the House of Lords under Gordon Brown's cabinet. And then she served for 5 years as the leader of the opposition in the House of Lords. She has a wealth of experience, and I'm really honoured for her to be part of this because many years ago she was my mentor, and so I'm really proud that she's part of this. And then we also have Lord Jack McConnell, who was the First Minister of Scotland from 2001 to 2007. He served as UK Special Representative for Peacebuilding from 2008 to 2010. And then he was appointed to the House of Lords. He's currently co-chair of the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on the UN Global Goals for Sustainable Development, and he's the Vice President of UNICEF UK. So we're very, very honoured and proud that they're part of us. I'm now going to hand it over back to Jess, who will tell you a little bit about the event, and then we'll take it from there. Over to you, Jess.
Thanks. And yes, the moment you've all been waiting for, the event today. We're going to be talking about progressive foreign policy in action, and we're delighted to have two amazing speakers with us, former Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden, Margot Wallstrom, and Shadow Foreign Secretary Lisa Nandy, MP. They will be speaking from their experience of both the ambition for a progressive foreign policy and how it works in actuality. The event will be chaired by Jack, and we're delighted that Jan will be providing some closing remarks. So we'll open up now for the first 30 minutes or so of an in-conversation between Jack, Margot and Lisa. We'll then have about 20 minutes for Q&A. If you have a question, please raise your hand in the participants box, or you can drop a question in the chat box as well. If you'd like to tweet about the event, we're at LFPG. And once we're finished, Peymana and I are going to stay on the line for about 15 minutes afterwards to talk about the Labour Foreign Policy Group. And so if you're interested in membership or getting more involved, do stick on the line then. So on that note, I'd like to hand over to Jack. Thank you, Jack. Oh, you're on mute, Jack.
Somebody has just muted me. Sorry, drum roll via Zoom. First of all, a big thank you and congratulations to the small but extremely enthusiastic team who have managed to launch this new organisation, which I think has been long overdue in the Labour Party and can really provide a forum for, I believe, the hundreds of members who will want to be involved in foreign policy discussion. And a big thank you to everybody who has joined this event this evening. We have two excellent speakers, guests this evening, and really looking forward to what they have to say. And I want to start by inviting Margot Wallstrom to say a few words. Margot is a good friend, a long-time friend, never seems to get any younger, but when I look back at the various things that I could mention in introducing her, it's quite an awesome record. She was first elected a member of the parliament in Sweden in 1982, which seems a very long time ago, but of course in more recent years has served as EU Commissioner for the Environment, played a central role in the Kyoto Agreement, as EU Commission Vice President, as the first UN Special Representative for Sexual Violence and Conflict, and then more recently back in Sweden as Foreign Minister and Deputy Prime Minister. She's always had a lot to say and a massive influence on everybody around her, and I'm delighted that she is going to kick off this discussion this evening with some thoughts on her time, her creation of a feminist foreign policy in Sweden and the state of the world as we find it today, and those of us on the left and centre left try and come to grips with the challenges of developing a foreign policy for the 21st century. Over to you, Margot.
Thank you so much, Jack, and everybody. Thanks for the invitation. It's a great honor and pleasure, of course. And it's on a very special day, because today the General Assembly of the United Nations opens, and we also have this as an International Day for Peace. Nobody has realized that, I think, yet, but let's see what happens. There's still a few more hours to go. Congratulations to this initiative. And I think it is particularly important in the times we live, where we see so much fear and unrest in the world. And to be able to organize something like this, for people to come together to discuss also radical foreign policy is so important. It is indeed a time where we live in a pandemic, but also when you thought maybe that this would bring us more into believing in institutions and multilateralism, the opposite is happening, a growing mistrust in multilateralism and a setback for democracy. And for the first time in many years, we now have more countries moving backwards when it comes from a democratic point of view than moving forward. And we see in the world more problems than solutions, that's for sure. And we as internationalists, of course, regret Brexit because if we stand together, we will be stronger, for example, to position ourselves against how Russia is acting, and also against Lukashenko and everything that goes on in Belarus at the moment. I would love to say something about how we formed our foreign policy. It is now 6 years ago when we took office after the election, and we decided on, I would say first, that luckily we have a lot of consensus on the priorities for foreign policy in Sweden. We agree that we believe in multilateralism, we believe in being members of both the United Nations and the European Union, active, although critical members of both the UN and the European Union. Our defense for democracy and human rights, our belief in free trade and a generous development policy as well. And this, of course, if you have consensus on these things, it makes the foreign policy predictable and I think trustworthy, and it is indeed a strength for our country. But we also wanted, after 8 years of a conservative government, or at least they call themselves an alliance, but with the Center Party and the Liberal Party and Moderaterna, we decided that we wanted also to give a profile, our profile and our priorities room in four priorities, 4 points. First, that we of course understood that there would be a focus on how we could reach peace and freedom for people in our neighborhood, and meaning of course around the Baltic, and with a focus on what goes on in Russia and Ukraine particularly. But peace and freedom must always be the first priority. We decided that we would also put more focus on the United Nations. And as you know, we ran and became a candidate for membership of the Security Council, and we managed to get a seat on the Security Council. So for 2 years we served there. We decided that we would pursue a feminist foreign policy. And I will say just something short about that also. But we also wanted to you know, all of these 4 points actually in Swedish, they all begin with an F, because I like these alliterations and I like to make it easy for people to remember. But we also wanted to open up for more of consultations with civil society and ordinary citizens on the foreign policy. And I opened up also the ministry. So we always would invite the organizations, civil society organizations to come, and we could consult them on different issues. If it was Syria or Myanmar or whatever happened in the world, we would invite those organizations concerned. But the feminist foreign policy is, of course, what maybe drew the most attention. To me, it was a matter of understanding that women, peace and security is indeed a particular theme. And with more women, there will be more peace. And the fact is that there are so few peace agreements that are being signed by women, or peace negotiations where women take part. And women make up half of the world's population, and we know that without them, there cannot be a sustainable peace. So to me, it belonged to the foreign policy from that point of view. If we want to work for peace and freedom and development, we cannot do it without women. And to me, it is also very practical. I know that the opposition tried to depict this as something that was only a slogan. No, not at all. On the contrary. And I quickly realized that I had to explain this in terms of sort of a few guiding principles or parameters that all our embassies would use in their work for a feminist foreign policy. So it became 3 R's. It became rights, of course, meaning legal and human rights. Can women open a bank account? Can women vote? Can women take part in important processes, democratic process in their countries? What about representation? Are they around the table where most important decisions are being made? And thirdly, resources. What about gender budgeting? Are resources used also to meet the needs of women and girls around the world? And I can say that after these years, we've seen also very good results, because if it was from the beginning met with a lot of maybe mistrust or maybe even laughed at in some quarters, I must say that it has turned into a huge interest, that this is a concept that other countries use as well for their foreign policy. And they understand that you have to make sure that women can enjoy the rights and representation and resources to be fully part of any peace or development process in any country. And we have excellent initiatives and results as well. And we, for example, also started our own network of female negotiators and mediators, because I've heard that too much in the UN and in the European Union. We don't have any women. So let's then make sure that there are enough women to appoint also as mediators. And that has also spread around the world. So now there are so many of these networks. And we did also, just to mention one small detail, but still important, you know, we did the Wikigap project. We we invited people to write more articles to place on Wikipedia, because we discovered that 90% of all the editors on Wikipedia are men. And there are so many stories missing and so much information missing. So that was a huge success all over the world, I would say, or in many, many countries. And there were tens of thousands of new articles placed on Wikipedia with the help of people. We were just an enabler for this, but you see the idea that we just have to make sure that women and women's experience and knowledge is also visible. Okay, well, as you understand, I can go on forever. But this is just a short version of a feminist foreign policy. And there is, we also put all of this together in a handbook that we have translated into English as well, with some of our experiences and some tips if you would like to proclaim that you will also pursue a feminist foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margot. A great combination of the visionary and the practical, as ever. Putting the two together. That's a great introduction. Very thought-provoking. Lots to talk about, and I can already see some very interesting questions coming up in the chat box. So I hand over now to Lisa Nandy MP, who, as I hope everybody on the call on this event knows, is the Shadow Foreign Secretary appointed by Keir Starmer following the leadership election of the new leadership in the Labour Party earlier this year. Lisa's been the Member of Parliament for Wigan since 2010 and served in some other frontbench roles over the years, but perhaps it'd be fair to say, came to prominence during that leadership election in the early part of 2020. And I was interested to see that just last week was described as one of Keir Starmer's key lieutenants, which was a good compliment, I think, to the way that she's handled this brief over the course of the last 6 months. Lisa, can I hand over to you to say a few words?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jack and Jan. And can I just start by thanking Jessica and Peymana, because not only is it a real pleasure to have a group that has been set up with to discuss these issues and debate them and to challenge one another, but the way in which you've done it, the constructive way that you want us to have this debate, is really, really welcome. Foreign policy has always been a contentious area in the Labour Party. I like to think living in a country that's now outside the European Union, but is still strongly committed to internationalism, whose socialism sees no borders, and who care about the world deeply and our place in it, and will start to rebuild some credibility for Britain when we get into government as a global player once again. And can I just say as well that it is a real pleasure to be part of a group in this world that is led by 2 women, and 2 young women in particular. I've been in many different briefs, as Jack said, over the last decade in Parliament, including energy and climate change, which was a particularly male-dominated world, but foreign policy is really something else. So thank you for bringing a breath of fresh air and much-needed change to this. And to Margot as well, who, you know, when I was appointed to this brief in April by Keir Starmer, it was a bit of a surprise, if I'm honest. I'm known more for the work that I do around in post-industrial towns in the north of England, and there was a sort of sense in which you do wonder when you stand against someone in a leadership contest whether you're going to be put in a cupboard for the next 4 years. It was great, actually, you know, to be appointed to this brief. Best job could possibly hope for, apart from Foreign Secretary, which I've now firmly got in my sights. And Margot's work and speeches were one of the first things that Jack and others sent me to read, and have been a real sort of guiding light in terms of what come next, because I think we've never had to start to rethink the way that we engage with the rest of the world, the way that the world comes together and negotiates shared challenges more. With the rise of China and the increasingly assertive behaviour of China, and the US and the actions of the current US administration stepping out of that leadership role, those 2 superpowers and the growing tension between them have been likened to a Cold War situation. I think the reality is it's far more complex than that. There is no global challenge that will be solved without the engagement of both the US and Chinese governments. But equally, Britain has to be in a position to stand up for our values and to speak from a place of strategic independence. And that's before you even begin to look at the destabilising impact of Iran in the Middle East. If you look at the actions of the Russian government recently, including the use of chemical weapons on the streets of the United Kingdom, the challenges are enormous. The world is more complex than ever, and we have a government that has decided not only to step out of that global leadership role, but also to tear up international law and the basis of our moral authority around the world. We've gained a reputation, as my friend Stephen Kinnock often says, who's on this call, as an alliance breaker rather than an alliance maker in recent years. And I think it's testament to the fact that Labour cares so much about this, that at 7 o'clock on a Monday night, we've got some of the giants of our movement on this Zoom call, as well as many of the Labour MPs, Stephen, Anna McMorrin, Wayne David, Kat McKinnell, who are participants in the struggles that come next. I think the biggest challenge of all is to collect, how do you connect the global with the local? For too many people in this country and around the world who are facing great insecurity at home, there has been a sense stirred and fueled by populist strongmen leaders in recent years that the interests of people in Bolton are pitted against the interests of people in Bangladesh, that working people on one side of the world and working people on the other are somehow in conflict with one another, and that we don't rise up together. What's more, those global institutions that are exists to bring us together, that we built after the Second World War to try to negotiate our way through shared challenges in the interests of the many, are in stasis. And for many people, when they look at those local problems that face them, that need global solutions, what they find is not only that those global institutions don't form part of the solution, but often are part of the problem. I'll just give you one example that is exercising me greatly at the moment at home, and that is the demise of Wigan Athletic. We're currently in a battle to save our football club because the Hong Kong owners pulled the plug earlier this year and plunged us into administration. This is a system of global finance that is allowed to run riot with no protection at all from the global institutions that were set up to support us. And the consequence of that is that people locally are losing something that matters to them way beyond what happens on the football pitch, part of their identity, their pride in their communities and their family history as well. And far too many of these problems, whether it's football, fraud or flooding, issues that I see in my constituency caseload every single week, the global system currently is unable to come together and find solutions to. And that is as true for trade as it is for any other area, where you have a model of trade that encourages governments to raise taxes on working people, to cut welfare spending in order to invest in infrastructure and create growth, that then creates products that working people who made them cannot afford to buy. And those products go out into the global system, they go into other countries and flood those countries with cheap goods, so that those workers in those countries are equally disadvantaged. The most obvious and pressing example of this at the moment is China. And those Chinese goods that are produced that workers in Beijing cannot afford to buy, going into the United States of America, so that the car worker in Chicago is encouraged to see the factory worker in Beijing as his enemy, when actually the problem is a global system that disadvantages both. So if we want to resolve the challenges that we have at global level, the great challenge that we have is to make sure that they are rooted in and delivering on the interests of people locally. And that is particularly true for women, because when taxes are raised on working people, when jobs are lost, when welfare systems are cut, women always bear the brunt first, and they bear the brunt hardest. So we have got to start rethinking the global system so that it starts to work for people again. Now, I am enormously optimistic about this, and perhaps I shouldn't be. Perhaps the lesson of the last decade is that progress is not inevitable. But after the Second World War, we came together as a world and we built a global system that wasn't perfect, but many of those institutions that we built lasted to this day. And I think the world is facing one of those moments right now. So we need a new global system, as Margot was saying, based on new values. So democracy, human rights, rule of law, freedom of speech, all these things deeply matter. But so too is human flourishing, a commitment to the environment, and a foreign policy that puts feminism right at its heart. Now, to do this, I think will take a different sort of leadership than we've seen so far. In recent years, we've seen the rise of the very sort of macho strongman leaders across the world, and we've seen through COVID-19 the absolute disaster of that sort of leadership. But where is the hope? Well, look to Germany, New Zealand, Denmark, Iceland, right across the world, in Taiwan as well. There are women leaders who are showing that compromise is not cowardice, that courage to be honest is the key ingredient of bringing people together and bringing with them, and who have the self-confidence to change their minds when they get things wrong. So let me say this, that we have talked a lot over the last few weeks, and certainly at Women's Conference as well, about some of the leaders that inspired us. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was topic of discussion at Women Connected on Saturday, who said that women belong in all the places where decisions are made. And I think that's absolutely right, that having women in those leadership roles matter. But look beyond those headlines, and what you see around the world is women who are already changing things. So Margot referred to the fact that women, when they're involved in peace negotiations and discussions, that is how you build much more longer lasting peace. And so look to those women in Belarus who are currently putting themselves in front of armed, masked men in order to show the world the face of courage. Look to those women in Afghanistan who are standing for election, who are entering the peace negotiations, but because they know that if the negotiations are simply between the government and the Taliban, then women's rights will be traded away for peace. And they're in that. And one of the things that I believe we can do in Labour now, as the official opposition with a platform around the world, is to start reaching out, as we've been doing through Catherine West in the Shadow team and others, to those women to say, we will build a global network and we will stand with you in solidarity. We've been working with our trade union colleagues in order to do it, to help to aid them in the struggles that they currently face and in the major battle which is to come, which is about whether the world pulls together in the face of COVID-19 or whether we break apart. Now, this October is the 20th anniversary of UN Resolution 1325, which was the first time that women's role was recognised in peace negotiations. We are going to mark that in the Labour Party because we have got to lay down a marker at this moment that these values matter, that how you do foreign policy matters, that who participates in foreign policy matters, and that we are determined in Labour to set the tone for what comes next, to change the values on which we engage, and to provide not just an opposition to this Tory government, but an alternative. Finally, I would just like to say this, that the world has never felt more unsafe and more unstable. We face the challenge of climate change, of COVID-19, of the rise of populism and strongman leaders, and how to build global solidarity in the face of insecurity, which has always been an enormous challenge for those of us on the left. I think in recent years there's been a pessimism that has crept into the way that participants in foreign policy on both left and right talk about our engagement with the rest of the world. On the one hand, there's been a sense from some of the participants on the right of British politics that the UK can only survive if we somehow shelter behind the global superpowers. Witnessed the debate around Huawei, where the Tory government was essentially weighing up a choice between whether we shelter behind the United States or whether we side with China. Well, I want to see us stand up for British interests, and British interests mean that we go out and we forge those global alliances around the world, that we shed light, not might, and that we work together for the common good. But on the left, I think there has been a sort of pessimism that's crept in too. You know, for many people who voted Remain, and I was one of them and campaigned for it too, there was a real sort of moment of devastation really after the referendum result came in. And I think that that's crept into a sort of sense that if we're outside of the European Union, that we're no longer internationalist. Well, I say that's not true. We were internationalists before we joined the EC, the EU, and we are internationalists still. Our socialism doesn't stop at borders. And we know in the end that solidarity is not the problem, but the solution, that working people here and working people on the other side of the world benefit when the world comes together and stands up for what is right. That is the sentiment that I'm determined to bring to this brief, that Britain is a proud country with great links around the world. We're not the Tory version of global Britain that goes out punching above its weight without ever stopping to ask why it is that we're punching at all. But we are the country that flies the pride flag outside our embassies around the world on LGBT Rights Day, because we know that in many countries the former Australian Prime Minister Anthony Shifley called the light on the hill for people in times of darkness. That is the ambition that I think we need. New thinking, feminism, environmentalism, human flourishing, new values fit for the 21st century.
I think if we were in a large conference fringe meeting outside the conference hall in Brighton or Manchester or Birmingham or Glasgow or somewhere else, then both of those introductory contributions would have had people on their feet cheering. And hopefully we can now have a short but interesting discussion on the points that have been raised. And I want I'm picking up on what Lisa said there about that, the way in which we try to bridge the everyday life experience of people, perhaps people who have left their support for the Labour Party behind over recent years. How we bridge that with this global agenda. I thought it might be interesting to probe a little bit there with Margot. You know, Margot, when you adopted a feminist foreign policy, what was the reaction of, you know, the working class Swedish Social Democrat voters whose immediate concerns maybe didn't have feminism just tripping off their tongue, and how did you, in your global initiatives that Sweden's so proud of, and we look to you so often as an example, how do you relate that global activity to the lives of ordinary Swedes who support you need to give you the permission to take these initiatives in the first place?
I think, first of all, thank you so much, and very inspiring to listen to Lisa as well, and this whole initiative I applaud, because I think you have also a particular challenge with Brexit and everything, and I think the polarized debate and those problems sort of socially as well. I think we were helped by the fact that we have pursued, I would say, and especially under Social Democratic lead, we have pursued a rather radical policy for gender equality for decades, with parental leave, with discussions about how to fight violence against women. And I remember that many years ago, actually, all the party leaders were asked about whether they were feminists, and they all answered yes to that. So for us, it is not a concept or a word with a negative connotation, but it's rather, we have already gone through a debate where we define feminism as thinking that women and men should enjoy the same rights, obligations, and opportunities. And that is actually also how the dictionary defines feminism. So to us, it was not the concept as such, but of course it has not been connected or defined as and linked to foreign policy. So when I announced this in front of all my ambassadors 6 years ago, there was a gasp, a loud gasp in the room. But as soon as I must say that very quickly, this turned into, and especially with these parameters that are very, very hands-on and very practical. Look in every country, are there child marriages? What about if a woman, is there laws that still discriminate against women? Are they there in all the negotiations, in parliaments, in governments? Can we help in the work that we do for democracy and enjoying human rights around the world? And when we had defined those parameters, when we had demystified the concept, I saw only enthusiasm. And I must say that they have done a marvelous job and became very, very convinced also about this being the right thing to do. And of course, we could use also our 2 years in the Security Council in constantly asking the question, where are the women? Why are there no peacekeepers that are women? Why are they not mentioned in these resolutions? And we set that as a target ourselves, that we should make sure that really scrutinize every product that came from the Security Council to make sure that told this story before, maybe you've heard it, but finally, you know, Olof Skog, who was our UN ambassador, said to me, you make me raise my hand and ask at every meeting, and there were, I don't know, 700 meetings during our time in the Security Council. You make me raise my hand and ask, where are the women? And in the end, I thought, where does this lead us? Does it bring any change on the ground? And then the whole council traveled to Mali, and the women came up to Olof and said, thank you so much for insisting on this being written into the resolution, because for the first time we clever questions in the chat. And I think to say that, you know, there is a way to go. You will have to turn it into a practical tool, and people have to see that this is a way to work with foreign policy to make sure that women are engaged the whole way and in every process. And you can do it through these rights. I mean, that was again my flair for these alliterations, but it turned out that has worked really well. It's simple to understand that these are the things you check. Do women actually enjoy the same rights, legal and human rights? And are they there? Are they represented? And what about the resources? And I don't know if you do gender budgeting, for example, if you have the statistics, that is very often the first thing we ask, also through our embassies. We ask, do you have the statistics to show how your different actions actually influence women and men respectively? Do you have the statistics and the facts so that we can do something about it? Can I just say lastly, I think that what we have globally is a problem with democracy and the democratic tools. Because now we see in the most powerful and biggest countries around the world, we have autocrats that are willing to do everything to ensure that they stay in power. And they undermine also the trust in the institutions, and including the democratic institutions. I think we have to figure out how to renew, of course, both our global systems, but also renew our democratic tools. Because people in your country, as well as in this country, want to see that we tackle inequalities and the fact that the gaps are growing between different groups of people. And as long as that happens, you know, they will not trust politicians, they will not trust the institutions. They want to see that there is some kind of policy that deal with the real problems that people have. So I think democracy and inequality will continue to be our most difficult challenges also for the future. But I think, you know, sometimes you have to stick your neck out. And I knew that this would be controversial. I knew that in many countries it would have a negative connotation. But it raised an interest, and very quickly people started to ask questions about it, and very quickly we got some followers as well, even big countries like Canada and Mexico and so on. And then you create expectations. Then they want to see, well, okay, so now this is the standard, this is the norm. Now we are we have the wishes and the expectations on us. That's how the political process will work.
Thanks,
so
Margot.
I think please dare.
Yeah, please dare. There's a lot of really interesting questions coming in through the chat, and I mean, rather than try and just pick out one or two of those, I'll try and maybe pick up some themes, and that way, hopefully, people's questions, at least in general terms, get addressed. And there's quite a few questions about the integration between foreign policy and defence, the whole issues around conflict, and the forthcoming integrated review in the UK, Lisa, that Labour will need to respond to in some way. You know, when would we intervene? When would we not intervene? How do we frame a new policy for a new age on that? So, Lisa, would you give us some thoughts on that link between foreign policy, security, the other shadow teams working together to try and get a coherent Labour view on this for the next decade and beyond?
Yeah, well, we're working very closely together, obviously, on the integrated review, but also just more broadly, because my sort of take on this is that Britain hasn't really had a foreign policy for nearly a decade now, certainly not since William Hague left office. I think we've seen the world almost exclusively from government eyes through the lens of trade and growth. And I think we're starting to see the folly of that now, not least in relation to China, but also, you know, if you look at the way in which the government is now going around the world piece by piece, trying to put together trade deals with countries with whom we've had very few alliances in recent years. And there's a crying need, I think, to start to rethink the way in which we engage with the rest of the world, the values on which that is based, because values in the end are your anchor, and in a world that is spinning out of control, that really matters. And so the integrated review we see very much as part of Labour's thinking about how you bring together all of these things, economic priorities, domestic priorities, foreign policy priorities. In the end, this is about what sort of country do we want to build? What sort of country will Keir Starmer lead in 2024? And what values are that based on? And take those values out into the world and work with others in order to advance them. So I guess that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that in turn, that the insecurity in the world and dealing with that insecurity is my top priority. I think making the world a much more stable, much more secure, much safer place is an absolute burning imperative for whoever is in government. And that leads you to a view of defence that is much larger than an argument at Labour Party conference about whether or not you renew Trident. So it leads you to a view of Britain's role in the world and our security and our stability as seeing wider objectives like climate change, like opportunities for young people in every country of the world, like the low pay and human insecurity that exists around the world as critical security issues. Because it is these things and these things going untackled that are fueling insecurity. And, you know, it's no use the left looking at strongman leaders who've arisen, whether it's Donald Trump in the United States or Bolsonaro or anywhere else, and just simply railing against those decisions and those decision makers. We have to have a much more nuanced understanding of the forces around the world that have driven shifts in public opinion, that have given rise to those strongman leaders, and we have to have a story to tackle it, which is why I put things like pay and working conditions and unemployment absolutely at the heart of this, and why I think that the problems that we're dealing with in parts of England that fueled Brexit and the vote to leave the European Union are the same as the problems in the Rust Belt that gave rise to the election of Donald Trump. And I'll just finally say this, is that the reason that I think this is such an important topic for the first Labour foreign policy group is because look at the approach that this government has taken. Climate change is one of the biggest sources of global instability that we are now dealing with. It's fueling and land, mass movement of people, which is fueling populism and far-right activism. Who bears the brunt of that? Women, right across the world, whether it's the growing violence, whether it's natural disasters, whether it's just the wider effects of climate breakdown, it is women around the world who bear the brunt of that. Who is going to lead the UK's hosting of COP26 and the climate change negotiations? Men. You've got Alok Sharma, you've got Lord Callanan, you've got Zach Goldsmith, you've got Kwasi Kwarteng, you've got Boris Johnson, you've got Dominic Raab, and every single one of the senior negotiators drawn from the civil servants is a man. This just simply isn't good enough. Not only can those negotiations not succeed, but Britain ought to be showing a different face to the rest of the world. We ought to be showing people that we stand up for and live our values. And that's why I say that Labour has to provide an alternative to this government and not just an opposition.
Thank you very much. Fabulous. There's been a lot of questions in the chat about power and about the power of Europe, the power of the UK in a world that is dominated increasingly by conflict and the actions of the United States, Russia and China in different ways. Margot, you've dealt with these superpowers in different ways over your time from back at Kyoto, trying to deal with the Americans not signing up to obviously EU relations with Russia, and you had the direct experience of working with China as foreign minister and through the UN again. How do the UK, Sweden, Europe find a role in this world that helps to deal with that power, which increasingly is in leaders who stay on for much longer than what would be a normal term of office in our part of the world.
Thank you. Can I just start by agreeing with Lisa, because you know, it's now 40 years since Olof Palme led the commission, and they came out with a report called Common Security. And that was an attempt to redefine security. It's not only military security. Today, it is much more cyber security. It's human security. And we've seen it with the pandemic that maybe one day will allow us to actually start to look at what are the reasons why we have these recurring zoonosis that transfers diseases from animals to humans, and start to discuss how we can avoid that we have another pandemic the next year because of our own human foolishness. But I think that this is so important. And I would say one more thing: if you shape a new foreign policy, then you have to say that security, the first line of defense, is always political and diplomacy. So you also have to invest in that. And I took the initiative and I proposed, and now it has been decided, to start a center for learning more about China. And also, of course, a center for Russian, knowing more about Russia. So you need to bring together the experts, the researchers, all the knowledge. You have to talk to civil society. You have to make sure that you do all of that people-to-people contacts. You have to bring all of that experience and knowledge together. And maybe it's time to do that in other places as well. So to broaden the security concept, that is absolutely crucial, absolutely crucial. Not to say that you don't have to do a defense, ordinary military defense as well, but we have another threat, and that is the one from nuclear weapons. And when the US now starts about, and not only that, sets aside a budget for restarting nuclear bomb tests, then you think you're crazy. What is going on? But anyhow, that is one advice, because I think that that's something we learned. Instead of closing embassies, we ought to open more embassies. We need to establish and broaden the diplomatic presence. We have to be there to also encourage that. Of course, if we look at China, I mean, I don't know where to start, but as we know now, geopolitics is changing, and China is appearing and acting in a much more self-assertive way, and I would say even aggressive way. And in Sweden, we saw after the case with Gui Minhai, the journalist that is in jail, we've seen that they are ready to do both this and that. Also acting against our media, the journalists that write in a critical way about China. And this is where it becomes difficult, because so far the strength we have is, of course, if we can act united, stay united in the European Union, because then we are a market that they cannot ignore. And we have to have a policy that is, as much as possible, one that we can have in common. And I must say that was a few of the last meetings that I attended were really about, in a clear-eyed way, about the role of China and what the European Union will have to do, because it's easier if they can break us apart and if they can put pressure on one country after the other. But do we stay united? We can continue with our sanctions against Russia. We can act in a coherent and consistent way also against China. So unity is always the answer when it comes to international cooperation and multilateralism as well.
Thank you very much, Margot. I want to one other thing that's come up quite regularly in the chat that we haven't really touched on, and that's Iran, Saudi Arabia, Middle East. An area of that the UK government, I think has been questioned on over recent times in terms of the consistency of our approach and policies. Lisa, in terms of that part of the world and the challenges of UK foreign policy in relation to engaging with Iran, being so close to Saudi Arabia, the horrific tragedy in Yemen, and of course the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict. Any thoughts that you'd like to pass on to our audience tonight, and maybe one final contribution before we hand over to Jan?
Not exactly Paxman, is it? Yeah, okay. Well, just a couple of things, thoughts from me on that. And Wayne David is on the call, who's our Shadow Minister for the Middle East, so I'm slightly nervous that he's going to be marking my homework on this. But I guess the first thing I would say is that Labour's debate around the Middle East over recent years has been very, very focused on Israel and Palestine. And as somebody who, until I was appointed as Shadow Foreign Secretary, was the chair of Labour Friends of Palestine and had been involved in that for a decade, I obviously believe that the Israel-Palestine question is absolutely central, and one that Britain rightly takes a strong interest in, and one that we have to continue to focus on. But I think at times that has been at the expense of taking a wider look at what is happening in the region and understanding the different dynamics at play there. And that has led us to focus less on the role and the central role that Iran plays in that region. And it's something that I want to recommit to under Labour. So, for example, when Keir and I met with the Israeli ambassador, when we were both first took on our new roles, we talked about the Palestinian question, and we talked about the annexation plans, which Labour is and remains very opposed to. But we also asked questions about about Israel's relations with Iran, about the relations with Saudi, and we've been working our way around ambassadors from across the Middle East as well to make sure that we zoom out and take a look at the region as a whole and have a much more nuanced understanding about it. I think that the actions of the US are critical in all of this, and I think the US elections will make quite a big difference given the impact that a Trump administration has had, not just on the annexation question, but also on the Iran nuclear deal, which is absolutely critical. I think there's no question that a Biden government a Biden presidency would be very, very different, but there still challenges remain. And it's important that in the Labour Party we retain a very strong focus on this, and reach out beyond the United States to key allies who want to see a resolution to this issue. Alongside that, I would put Yemen and Syria as major issues that have fallen off the political agenda because of COVID-19, but the world cannot afford to abandon, to ignore, or to look away. The conflict in Syria has now been raging for longer than the Second World War. This is something that the world has to come together and resolve. In the short term, I don't see much prospect that that is going to be resolved by the UN for obvious reasons. So I think that countries like ours need to step up. Recently, Samantha Power, talking to a group here in Britain, said that she believed that the world should build coalitions of the willing who are prepared to come together behind lead negotiators in order to start to make progress on some of these long-standing conflicts. That is something that I support, that we support. And just finally say this, I guess, is that we may not be in power, but we should never believe that we're powerless. And I have been really struck by the willingness of governments around the world to engage with Keir and I and the Shadow team as we've sought to forge those links and build an approach that's based on making, not breaking, those alliances. There is a real sense, particularly in countries like Syria, Yemen, Libya, that Britain is needed, and strong voices from Britain is needed. And, you know, as I said at the beginning, there is a really pressing need for people to see that there is a light on the hill in times of darkness. These are very dark times indeed, and even in opposition, Labour can play that role.
Well, thank you very much to both of you. Thanks to everybody who's contributed in the chat to the issues that we've discussed. I think in both Margot and Lisa's contributions, we've seen just the potential, if we take a stand internationally, the potential for left of centre governments to make a real difference, and how much it's needed. And two outstanding speakers we've had joining our event tonight. And I want to thank them and thank everybody else, but also hand over to the co-president of this new group, Jan Royal, who is going to close the event. Over to you, Jan.
Thank you very much, Jack. That was a wonderful discussion and lots of amazing questions in the chat. So it's just not possible to sum up the sort of discussion. But this discussion gives me immense hope for our party, but hope for our policies and hope for our influence in the world. Earlier this week, Antonio Guterres, talking about the SDGs, said the weight of history is on our shoulders. The whole planet is at stake. We need to change course. And I know from everything that I've heard today from Lisa, but of course also from Margot, that we are going to help our country change course, because as Lisa said, we are not just an opposition. We are going to, or you, Lisa, and your brilliant team, because you have got a brilliant team, you are going to provide an alternative. And whilst, yes, we might not be in power, we are not powerless. And I know that your voice is going to be hugely important around the world. It could be quite depressing, or is depressing, to look at the world as it is and the way in which populism has transformed politics in so many countries. But there is hope, and I think everything that you've said, Margaret, about what's happening, has happened in Sweden, gives us immense hope. I mean, who'd have thought that a feminist foreign policy could be something that so many countries want to emulate, because you really are bringing about change in the world. But one thing we can learn, another thing we can learn from you, is the consensus that you have in your country on foreign policy. And I think, Lisa, that the question that you've been posing about how to connect the global with the local, that is going to be one way in which you are going to bring about more of a consensus in our country, which is much needed. And I think that young people, and I know that you've done a huge amount of work on young people, or working with young people. And I think that the potential of young people to work together to bring about change is something that you can really tap into, because they constantly demonstrate that they've got a passion for action and a passion for progress, which is exactly what you and your team have. So in terms of this great new group, we're there to support you, to draw on the expertise of so many people around this table this evening and others. And as I think you pointed out earlier, foreign policy can be divisive, but that amazing woman, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, said you can disagree without being disagreeable. And I hope that this group will be a place where we can disagree agreeably, we can listen to each other and help to find a consensus for a better way forward for our country. Of course, it will be for you and your team to decide what route we as a country, we as a party should take. But we are there to help you, to support you, and to have those difficult discussions, because it's easy for us to do that in closed rooms and it's more difficult for you. So we're there for you. We will do whatever we can to ensure that, as you said, it's great being the shadow foreign secretary, but hell, we need you to be the foreign secretary. Our party needs that, our country needs that, and we'll do everything we can to get you there. So thank you everybody for being here this evening. It's just such a pleasure and a joy to be associated with this new group. Thank you.